get a little bit nervous. Well, you got to control them, right? So to control this large slave population, formal codes were established. To control the large slave population, formal codes were established. And these codes were established to do two things. So to keep these enslaved blacks under control, codes were enacted. And these codes were enacted to basically establish two things. The first thing these codes were established to do was to define the slave's legal status. To define the slave's legal status. What do I mean by that? What do you think I mean by that, Kylie? Slave's legal status.
Where they are, like the social ranking.
Right, and what they can do and what they can't do, right? Legal status, you know, are they allowed to vote? Are they allowed to marry? Are they allowed to have children? Are they allowed to speak? Are they allowed to go to the bathroom? I mean, that's a legal status, believe it or not. So the first thing these codes were formed to do was to define the slave's legal status. The second thing it was set up to do was to define their master's prerogatives. Define their master's prerogatives. So Gracie, look up the word prerogatives and tell us what that means. Define their master's prerogatives. So the two things that these codes were established to do was one, define the slave's legal status, and two, define their master's prerogatives. What's prerogatives? Real simple explanation for that. Close. Okay, prerogatives. Go ahead and say it. Find it. Starts with a P, what I'm looking for. Okay, prerogatives. What's something that starts with a P they define? Don't make me get my glasses.
Oh, I got it.
What is it? Power. Very good. Their prerogatives are their power. So the two things that these formal codes were established to do was define the slave's legal status and define their master's prerogatives or powers. And these codes became known as the Barbados Slave Code of 1661, which you have right in front of you here. You need one more?
Yeah.
So we're going to read through these, and you tell me what you think the slave's rights are and the master's prerogatives are when we read through this. So we'll read through this together. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 was a law passed by the colonial English legislature to provide a legal base for slavery in the Caribbean island of Barbados. The Code's preamble, which stated that the law's purpose was to, quote, protect them, meaning slaves, as we do men's other goods and chattels, established that black slaves would be treated as chattel property in the island's court. The Barbados Slave Code ostensibly sought to protect slaves from cruel masters and masters from unruly slaves. In practice, it provided far more extensive protections for masters than for slaves. The law required masters to provide each slave with one set of clothing per year. One per year, girls. Can you imagine that? But it set no standards for slaves' diet, housing, or working conditions. However, it also denied slaves even basic rights guaranteed under English common law, such as the right to life. It allowed slaves owners to do entirely as they wished to their slaves, including mutilating them and burning them alive without fear of reprisal. Throughout British North America, slavery evolved in practice before it was codified into law. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 marks the beginning of the legal codification of slavery. The Barbados Assembly reenacted the Slave Code with minor modifications in 1676, 1682, and 1688. The Barbados Slave Code also served as the basis for the slave codes adopted in several other British colonies, including Jamaica, 1664, South Carolina, 1696, and Antigua, 1704 or 02. The legal basis for slavery was established in Mexico in 1636. These statutes created the status of chattel slave for those of African descent. They were slaves for life, and the status of slave was inherited. How about that? The status of slave was inherited. What does that mean? Slave status passed to through the mother in these statutes. Virginia's 1662 statute read, "All children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of their mother."
So it's like when the guy at the house sleeps with the slave and then she has a baby, the baby's a slave.
That's correct. Forever. And that baby's a slave. And that baby, I mean, how about brutal are these? How many rights did the black slaves get out of this deal? I think the key comment, the key comment in here is this one here. It provided far more extensive protections for masters and for slaves. Now, Hannah, look up chattels for me. See what it says. Chattel slave. So we're not confused on that. C-H-A-T-T-E-L-S. Black slaves would be treated as chattel property. C-H-A-T-T-E-L. C-H-A-T-T-E-L.
Item of tangible property other than real.
Read that. Say that one more time.
Item of tangible property other than real.
So basically it's like owning a hammer or a saw, but not your house. Okay. So I mean, you're not even a human being. You're a piece of property other than real estate. Okay. This is what they lived on. Okay. Now, the thing that I think you probably got out of here is this gave slave masters what over their slaves? Complete control, including the right to inflict any punishment they see fit, even with the slightest of infractions. Oh, spoke out of turn, whip you, mutilation. I mean, it was brutal, okay? These slaves had no rights whatsoever. And that's the part you should know about the Barbados Slave Code of 1661. Sad thing is, they incorporated part of this in the colonies, and we're going to talk about that later. Okay, so, before long, these farmers in the West Indies began to migrate from the West Indies to where? That's our topic. Southern colonies. And they did that for two reasons. Two reasons why farmers of the West Indies began to migrate to the southern colonies. Think about the location. Why might a farmer decide, oh, hell with it, I'm just going to go to the southern colonies? Because what are they getting from the southern colonies to survive? They can't eat sugar their whole life. Food and supplies. So a lot of these sugar farmers were depending on North America anyway, especially the mainland, for food and supplies. And what were the smaller farmers being squeezed out by? The greedy sugar barons, you have sugar lords. And so they were just getting squeezed out. The rich get richer. So farmers of the West Indies began to migrate to the southern colonies because they depended on the North American mainland for food and supplies anyway, and the big sugar lords were running them out. It's kind of like Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The billionaires are running the millionaires out of Jackson Hole, and the millionaires are all moving to Bozeman, Montana, just so you know. But I mean, you see how that can work? To live in Jackson Hole 10 years ago cost a lot less money to live in Jackson Hole now, because the billionaires have come in and bought everything up and ran the millionaires out. I don't know where that puts you and I, but not in Worley. That's where it puts us, right? Anyway. Well, the first group of farmers that arrived in the Carolinas from Barbados did so in 1670. So the first group of farmers that arrived in the Carolinas from Barbados did so in 1670.
Is this our next thing or not? Okay.
Nope, still going.
What's Barbados?
Okay, Barbados is an island in the West Indies, yeah. What did they bring with them? They brought two things with them besides themselves. Slaves and what we just talked about?
Sugar.
The slave code. So these farmers that went to the Carolinas in 1670 from Barbados, which, good question, Shania, excuse me, is an island in the West Indies, okay? They brought with them slaves and that crude slave code to the Carolinas. And it was in 1696 that Carolina became the first colony to adopt what? A version of the Barbados slave code. So it was Carolina, which when it first came about, there was no North and South Carolina, right? It was just one Carolina, right? And we'll talk about how that splits up later. But these guys went to the Carolinas, they brought their slaves, the model of the Barbados slave code, and finally, in 1696, Carolina became the first colony to officially adopt a version of that slave code. So who brought a majority of the slaves, the philosophy of slavery, into the colonies? Yep, basically you could say both. You could say small farmers, and you could also blame the sugar lords, like Kyle said, because they drove them out. Now, here's the sad statement. Because of this situation, the West Indies would serve as a staging area for the slave system that would take root where? In North America. Okay? So I'll read that again. Because of this situation with farmers moving to the Carolinas, the West Indies is now going to serve as a staging area for the slave system that would take root in North America. What's a staging? Anybody a four-wheeler? Anybody do a lot of four-wheeling here? What's your staging area when you go four-wheeling? Anybody know that? Where do you stage? What does stage mean? So all of us, I've said, you know what? We all got four-wheelers. By God, let's go up to the Bighorns and go up to East Tensleep Lake. And we're going to stage at
So where you meet?
a certain place where you meet. It's the hub of where we're all going to take our four-wheelers out and then take off from there. We're going to East Tensleep Lake. Well, the West Indies became the staging area where all these black slaves went from the staging area in the West Indies to the colonies. Okay? So we weren't going over to Africa really and getting our slaves from this point on. Where were we going to get them? West, they had 250,000 of them. They had plenty of them. Why go clear to Africa to get them when you can get them right down the West Indies, you know, not too far, 300 miles from the coastline. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay, tomorrow we'll talk about colonizing the Carolinas. Is anybody going to be gone tomorrow? Okay, just get, we'll record up here. Where are you guys going tomorrow?
How?
How? Do you know what time you're leaving?
We're not sure. She